Hi guys and welcome back to my channel. Today I am here with the next update for my 100 pans project pan. If you haven't been following along, I'm trying to pan on 100 eyeshadows this year. Am I crazy? Maybe. But I'm going to talk about where I am with all my eyeshadows today and how many I've hit pan on in the last quarter. So without any further ado, if you're new here, please consider subscribing. I would love to have you in the family. But let's just jump into the first eyeshadow. So we're going to start with the first eyeshadow that I hit pan on in the quarter, and it actually comes from my Naked palette by Urban Decay. I'm using this together with the Naked 3 as a focus palette in my Panda's eyeshadows. And the shadow that I hit pan on first in the quarter is the shade Smog, which is here, and I did hit pan on it in my Panda's eyeshadows project, and it took me 17 times to hit that pan. Next up we actually have a single eyeshadow, like a compact single that I hit pan on. This is the shade Calistro by Nars, and I did hit pan on this in my whole collection project pan. It did take me 13 times to hit that pan. Next up we have another single, but that's actually like a magnetic single, and it's from one of my Colourpop palettes, and it's actually the shade Labyrinth from the Element of Surprise, but I had it in my Shea palette in the shade, or like in the place of Mademoiselle. But I had this in my whole collection project pan again, and it took me 30 times to hit that tiny pan, and it's actually currently in my Shop My Stash, so I'm hopefully gonna expand the pan, but I haven't reached for it yet. But that is a tiny pan after 30 uses. The next pan I hit was from my A to C project pan, and that is the shade Queen Bee, which comes from my Aha Honey palette by Colourpop. This one took me 16 times to hit pan on. It's like a medium amount of time, but for Colourpop is quite a little amount, and it's because this is one of the more crumbly formulas. Next up we have a palette that got a lot of love in the last quarter, and that is my Subculture Palette by Anastasia. I hit pan on the shade Electric, and this one only took me 7 uses to hit pan on, and it was in my A to C project pan. Next up we have a shadow that I hit pan on kind of on my own. It wasn't in any project or anything, and that is the shade Aziza. That is the shade right here. I did have Hadia in my Panda eyeshadows, I believe, but this one I did work on separately, and I did pan on this one as well. So I don't have the amount of uses it took because I don't track uses on eyeshadows that I'm not panning, but I did hit pan on this one as well. The next eyeshadow I hit pan on comes from my Panda Palettes, and it looks very different now to what it did then, but the shade that I hit pan on I still have pan on now, and that is the shade Foxy right here. I did hit pan on that one after 64 uses. And I think 64 uses is probably one of the highest numbers that I've had. I think this palette in general have some of the highest numbers it took me to hit pan on shadows ever, but it's because it's all matte and it's Urban Decay, and the pans are super deep. So yeah, it took me 64 uses to hit pan on Foxy, and it was also the last shade that I hit pan on in this palette, although I have repressed obviously a few shades since then. We're still in July, and the next pan I hit was from my Soft Glam palette, and I hit pan on the shade Orange Soda. This one was in my A to C project pan again, and it took me 28 uses to hit that tiny pan again. This is more of a hard pressed formula, but I don't mind that because I actually love this shade so much. It's a beautiful kind of transition shade to use in summer for me. The next palette is my Tri palette by Juvia's Place. I had this shade in my Panda's eyeshadows, and that was the shade Curla, which is down here. This one took me 13 times to hit pan on, and this palette is starting to look very loved, which I am so excited about because I do really love this palette as well. Next up we actually have another palette that I hit pan on like without a project. I started focusing on this because it is one of the Super Shock formulas from Colourpop in a palette, and that is from my Sweet Talk palette, and it is the shade Side to Side. I really wanted to hit pan on it before it started to crumble too much, and it was already quite difficult to use because it is quite crumbly, but I mainly used this as a topper shade, and again I don't have any tracked uses because I didn't pan this in a project. The next pan, we're going back to my Subculture palette again. This shade is the shade New Wave, which was in my A to C project pan again, and this one took me 23 uses to hit pan on, which is quite a lot, but these shades are so pigmented in here. I'm currently trying to hit pan on Untamed, which I'm worried about because it is a really deep shade that isn't too easy for me to use. But yeah, Untamed was a beautiful shade to reach for, and I reached for this quite a lot in combination with Orange Soda because they two laid really nicely, and this kind of just blended out nicely. But I also used this a lot on its own, and it's honestly one of my favorite kind of orange and yellow shades in my collection. Then we finally come to the last pan that I hit in July. I don't know, it's a lot. I'm going to summarize it in a second, but that comes from my Beauty Bay and Naked Tutorials palette, and I hit pan on the shade Plot Twist, which is this blue shade right here, and this one was in my Panda's eyeshadows again, and it only took me 5 uses to pan on the shade because it is a really pastel shade that I had to build up a lot, and these pans are very shallow as well, so only 5 uses to pan on Plot Twist. So just to summarize, July was a really good panning month for me, and I actually pan on 12 pans in July, which is insane. If I remember correctly, I think I had a down month earlier, so I knew I had to pick up the pace, but in July was just outstanding, and I hit 12 pans, which is so good. I think I need to be around 8 to 9 pans a month to hit my goal, so I was way over that in July. So that was really exciting, but let's move on to what I hit in August. So in August, the first shade that I hit pan on comes from my Juvia's Place Magic mini palette, and I hit pan on the shade Aya, I don't know how to pronounce it, Aya I'm gonna say, and that is this deep shade right here. I had this in my Panda's eyeshadows, and it took me 13 uses to pan. By the way, this is another palette I'm going to mention a lot in this video because I do have a few more pans coming up. The next eyeshadow I hit pan on again comes from my Naked palette, but it wasn't from my Panda's eyeshadows. Actually, I rolled a shade of this in to my Deco Panning Project pan because I got to choose, I think, a shade on my own or something like that, or like my oldest something, I can't remember, but I decided to roll in this eyeshadow, which is the shade Naked right here. It's a beautiful transition shade, and it only took me 9 uses to pan on it, but the only reason why it only took me 9 uses is because I already had a massive dip in this shadow, because it probably was my most used shadow in here before I started panning, if that makes sense, because I do really love that, and when I only had this palette in my collection, I used that shade all the time. So I did tell you that this palette is very well loved for the last quarter, so I have another pan in here for the next pan, and that is the shade Suba, which is this one here. This one was in my A to C product pan, and it took me 10 uses to hit pan on this shade. Next up we have another single shadow, and this one is one that was in my Panda's eyeshadows, and that is the shade Untamed. It wasn't too long since I rolled this out, and this one took me 22 uses to hit pan on. Quite a lot, but I absolutely love this shade, and these pans are rather deep. They're like regular singles eyeshadows, but those usually take a bit longer to hit pan on. Next up we have a shade from my Nude Light Obsessions by Huda Beauty, and I was working on the kind of purple shade in this palette, which is the top one there. It is the only pan that I have in this palette, and it took me 6 uses to hit pan on this, and I was working on this shade in my Panda's eyeshadows as well. So yet again we have come back to my Subculture palette, and this is actually a shade that I hit pan on again without a project. I decided to focus in on the shade Cube up here because I thought that would work really well as an inner corner highlight, and it did. I also used this as a face highlight a couple times, but yeah, I really love that shade, and I don't have any uses again because I wasn't tracking it, but I hit pan on Cube. Then for the last shade that I hit pan on in August, we have a shade from my Anastasia Jackie Aina palette, and that was the shade Ginger. This one was in my A to C product pan, and it's this shade right here, and it took me 15 uses to hit pan on this. So August wasn't as good of a month, but I wasn't expecting so either, especially after July when I pan on so many shades, because it also means that I had to start kind of fresh on new eyeshadows for August. So I only hit pan on 7 shades, but that's still pretty good, so I'm happy with that. But let's move on to the last shades that I hit on this quarter, which comes from September. The first shade is another one that comes from my A to C product pan, and that is the shade HWY, but it's technically Floaties from the Soul palette, but I have merged my Soul and More palette together, which is why this was in that spot. But I hit this pan after 13 uses, and again in my A to C product pan. Another eyeshadow that I hit pan on in my A to C product pan comes from my Jackie Aina palette again. I hit pan on these two shades quite close together because I used them a lot together, and that is the shade Sponsored right here. This took me 7 uses to hit pan on, so not too much, but it was a shade that I used a lot of every time I used it. Next up we have another depotted shade, but this is one that is like a depotted from a Calistro palette, and this is the shade Bel Air from the I Think I Love You palette. This is just a beautiful transition shade, and I worked on this in my Panda's eyeshadows, and it did take me 25 times to hit pan on this. And I'm also realizing that this might be a spoiler for my oh actually wait, I think this is going up after my Panda's eyeshadows. I'm filming this before I'm filming a Panda's eyeshadows update, but I think my Panda's eyeshadows went up before, so I don't think it's a spoiler. But if you haven't seen my Panda's eyeshadows update yet, then it is. But I hit pan on this in the past month for my Panda's eyeshadows. Then the last single that I hit pan on this month is another one that I wasn't tracking. I just hit pan on it on my own, and that is this shade right here from Glam Shop it's quite hard to catch the pan. I think you can see it right there because it's such a iridescent white shade. But this is the shade Turbo Migelka. I can't pronounce it, but it's obviously Polish. It's a beautiful kind of bluish shift. It has a blue and a purpley pink shift, but it's still kind of a little bit more neutral than some other blue iridescents that I have, and I really enjoy this as an inner corner highlight. Next up, we're coming back to my Magic Mini palette from Juvia's Place, and the next shade that I pan on here is the shade Burnout, which is this bronzy shade right here. This one took me only 7 uses to pan on because I used this a lot as well, so every time I used it basically all over my lid, so not too many uses. And as I always mention, these pans are not very deep at all. Next up, we have another pan that is a spoiler from my Panda's eyeshadows update if you haven't seen that, and that is a shade from my Naked 3 palette, which was my last focus shade in my Panda's eyeshadows, and that is the shade Burnout, which is this one right here. This one actually only took me 15 uses to pan on, so not very much. I know other people worked on this shade like a lot, like I don't know, up to 40 uses. Alexa, I know if you're watching this, I know you use this definitely like 40 uses I think in your Panda's eyeshadows, but I think the reason why I pan on it so quickly is because I mainly use this with a really small detailed brush on my lower lash line, so the dip is very kind of focused, and I used, like, again, a small kind of dense brush to pick that up. So we actually have 2 pans to go, and again we're coming back to my Magic Mini palette, and the last shade that I hit pan on in here in the past month is the shade Gemoya right here. This one's in my A to C product pan, and it took me 10 uses to hit pan. And then the last pan that I've hit pan on as well since filming this, but also in August, is a shade from my Deuce palette by Juvia's Place, and this one is definitely a spoiler because I haven't updated this project yet, but I did hit pan on a shade that I'm working on in my whole collection product pan, and that is the shade Mont Blanc down here, and again it took me 10 uses to hit pan on this shade. So in September I hit pan on 8 shades, which is again pretty good, and that means at the end of August I had 76 pans, and if I'm looking at like where I should have been at the amount of pans at the end of September, I should have been at 74.8 pans, so that means I'm just over 1 pan ahead, and that's also giving me hope that I will actually manage to hit my goal before the end of the year. So where I am now, I only have 24 pans left to hit in the last quarter, and I'm hoping that will be able to happen, but we just have to see. But the next update for this project would actually be the finale as well, so that will come probably at the beginning of January next year, so 2022, which is crazy to say. But yeah, I really hope you enjoyed this video and seeing some pans, and I will catch you in my next one. Bye guys!